can you compare what it's like working with Alan in 1983 versus 1993 on 1963?
Well, with 1983, he was writing these incredibly dense scripts. And, I think the first script he ever sent me was for a story in Epic. And the first panel was 6 pages of typewritten description. The first
single
panel.
spaced, probably.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He had this old Olympia Royal he was typing on in those days. And I got the script for the double image 80-page giant annual here, the first 11 pages.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Comics Cube. I'm joined today by Mr. Rick Veitch, and today we're talking about 1963. Hi, Mr. Veitch. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thanks for getting a hold of me. We're here in Vermont, in the USA. They've legalized cannabis.
Mm-hmm.
So while we're talking, I'll be trimming my cannabis plants. It's harvest season this week, and we got to get them all clipped and drying. So if you don't mind, I'll be clipping as we speak.
That'll be fun. So we're talking about 1963, and in case anyone at all is unfamiliar with this 1963, up here where I'm pointing is a suggested video for the history of 1963 from Strange Brain Parts. But even that one, it needs a little bit of fact checking, because it basically said in it that Jim Valentino approached Steve Bissette. Steve Bissette approached Alan Moore. Alan Moore and then they approached you. That's not really true, is it? Like, you were there first.
I think I'm not really sure. I know Jim approached Steve first, and whether Steve called me or he called Alan, I don't really know.
Oh, okay. Because there's a comment in that video that basically said Steve Bissette said you were there before Alan. And there's an interview with Alan that says you were there before Alan. Like, Steve really puts you up front and center when he talks about 1963. So how do you remember getting involved?
I got a phone call from Steve. He and I had been working with Tundra, but Tundra was winding down. It was about to get sold to Kitchen Sink, and we could see the writing on the wall there. So we were looking for a new way to do our own comics outside of the large publishers of DC and Marvel, who we'd been having a lot of problems with in the previous 10 years. What's interesting, I think, about that time period is what was going on in the market. We were coming to the end of a really amazing decade of comics in America, the 1980s, where the distribution network had flowered, and the number of comic book stores had, mushroomed all around the country, so that comics were selling better and better, and they'd freed themselves from the Comics Code, which had limited what could be in comics. And it's kind of like a golden age, I think, of comics in America, as the 80s. Just a lot of great stuff came out, and a lot of stuff that ended up shaping culture, like Watchmen and From Hell.
Swamp Thing
came up in Swamp Thing, especially. Yeah. Swamp Thing was the one that really broke open DC Comics from their moribund, hidebound ways. So, but what was happening was that the market was exploding too fast. It was bubbling up. It had become like a crazy collector's market, where people were paying insane prices for comics that weren't worth anything. And so it was the beginning of people putting out endless number ones just for the collector markets. People were speculating on large boxes of comics before they were even printed. There was like this weird speculator market going to sell a lot of comics. A lot of comics never got on the stands. They just sat in boxes because these boxes were being bought and sold by shadowy dealers somewhere. A lot of it didn't make any sense at all. But at the same time, the Image guys had really kind of hit a home run out of the park by launching their imprint at the time they did. They were all refugees from Marvel. You know, they were like a lot of the top Marvel artists, and they decided to put their own company together, and it was just at the right timing. In the beginning, they used a lot of the rhetoric that my generation had used about creator rights, and it looked to us like, yeah, these guys, you know, they're standing up for creators, and they're stepping away from the big paychecks at Marvel, and they're doing it themselves. So it looked like a really, really good thing for us. We didn't understand at the time how precarious the business was, but it was getting ready to explode in a very bad way right while we were doing 1963. And I think that landscape, that business landscape, really helped shape and define what happened with 1963 and why the annual didn't happen, and why 1963 did not carry on. That was one of the big reasons.
Yep. People see the Image founders as a bunch of rebels and mavericks, but you know, you guys kind of paved the way for them.
We were trying to. I mean, it's two different generations.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Alan and Steve and I are like of a certain age, and Todd and Jim, those guys are like 10, 15 years younger. They're really ambitious people, but they're ambitious for themselves. Maybe not Valentino so much, because Valentino is our age, and I think he kind of, you know, is more like our side of the ledger on that one. But Alan, Steve, and I, and many other people in the 80s stood up against the big publishers, not for personal gain, but to kind of like bring the art form to its better potential, because we felt the art form was being by business. We all knew the stories of Siegel and Schuster and Jack Kirby and all these guys who got, you know, ripped off by the companies and exploited. And so we all felt a need to change that. And it wasn't just the creators, the retailers, the distributors, and the fans all kind of felt the same way. It was like, we got to fix this. You know, this is a beautiful American or worldwide art form, and it's kind of being strangled by business practices. So that's the difference. We were ambitious for ourselves to a point, but I think we were more ambitious for the art form itself, where the Image guys were really about themselves. And that's the split right there.
So it has to be said, you and Alan and Steve at this point had been working with each other for, I think, over 10 years, or at least 10 years at this point, because you were working together on Swamp Thing. So
that's what the three of us started working together, but Steve and I go back to Kubert School in the mid-70s. We met at Kubert School. We had this really tight creative relationship, worked on a lot of stuff together, lived together, or lived close to each other. So very, really great friendship. He's one of my best friends in life.
Yeah. And your relationship with Steve and Alan at this time was just aces, perfect by 1992.
Yeah. We had, having worked on Swamp Thing together, you know, I'd spent endless hours on the phone with Alan talking about all kinds of great stuff, not just comics, but all this metaphysical stuff that he and I are into. You know, I come at it through dreaming. He comes at it through magic, trying to figure out what consciousness really is. Many, many pleasant hours talking to Alan on the phone and learning a lot, you know, about a lot of different stuff, and just in awe of his writing, because he would turn these scripts around in 3 days, a full Swamp Thing script, not a word out of place. You know, it was just unbelievable what the guy did. And he was juggling Watchmen, and who knows what else at the same time. He's just, fantastic uh, artist and writer and production guy as well. And Steve too, just Steve is probably one of the most talented people I've ever met in my life.
Mhm.
He can write, he can draw, he can do it all. And so very fortunate to have both those guys as my friends.
Oh, Alan's in awe of you too. I think at one point he said that if the American comic industry were ever on fire, somebody save you so we can clone you and then extricate the entire history of American comics.
Yeah, well, he's just being a wise guy.
And when you guys proposed 1963, it was very different from the way Alan used to write scripts. Alan was a full script guy and he wanted to do Marvel style. How did you guys feel about that? And how was that received by Valentino?
Well, I think Valentino loved it because Valentino's a retro guy from day one. The whole concept was Alan's completely. Steve and I didn't have any input on the conceptualization of what 1963 was going to be. But our job was more to facilitate Alan's vision. And at first, I don't think we quite understood that it was meant to be deadpan. We thought it was like, oh, it's going to be a little humorous, we're going to make this a little funny, satirical. And he was like, no, I want it completely deadpan. I want it with big dots. I want it on pulp paper. And we're going to do, the only humor is going to be in the ads. He had this complete vision. He loved Acme Novelty Library. And he was seeing a package that was as packed with information and as perfectly designed, or attempted to be as perfectly designed as Acme Novelty Library. That was what I remember he said that in the beginning. So Steve and I took that and designed characters based on what Alan was telling us he wanted. And then it was our job to go out and figure out how to do the big dots printing, the old style Silver Age printing, and to get it on pulp paper because all this stuff was in the process of being lost. The American printing industry was moving toward these higher end packages for comics. And there weren't any presses anymore that were available to run this kind of stuff, much less create the big dot films that they needed. But Jim Valentino put us in touch with the printers and Murphy Anderson. Murphy Anderson is a Silver Age artist who also ran a production company out of Connecticut. And they still had the ability to make the big dot color films, basically by cutting in Rubylith, with these teams of people. So, and the printer was able to find a press that they were able to rehab, and they were able to find the right pulp paper, which had the right smell and the right feel, because 1963 is a tactile experience as well as a reading experience. It's meant to open up the gates of nostalgia to all us old aging baby boomers who had our noses in comics when we were kids. And that was Steve and I. We were able to pull all that together.
It is a tactile experience. It's not the same when if you're kind of just reading, pictures of it like on the internet. You have on it, you worked on Mystery Inc., which is a Fantastic Four takeoff. USA, which is Captain America takeoff. Horus, which is a Thor takeoff, but Egyptian.
Yeah.
And the Tomorrow Syndicate, which is the last one, which is kind of putting together the heroes and making and kind of it's pretty much the Avengers. Do you have a favorite among those?
No, I love them all. I think it's one of the most fun projects in terms of creativity that we ever worked on. I can remember like getting the faxes in from Dave Gibbons on the inks when he first inked my stuff, and I was just so knocked out. It was like he totally caught it, And I remember getting the first printed samples in from the printer, with the actual color on the pulp paper. And it was just such a great feeling to know that we were really catching it. You know, we knew we really had it. And then Alan was coming in with the bullpen bulletin pages.
Affable Al.
Excuse me?
Affable Al.
Affable Al.
Yeah.
And that was great too, because after he'd finished writing it, he would call me up and read it to me in this breathless sort of, you know, voice that I'd never heard before. But once I heard it, I knew that's exactly what Stan Lee was writing, you know, back in the day. And so that was really marvelous too. That creative part of it was just great, especially in the first 2 or 3 months before the business part of it hit. Steve and I kind of stupidly took on the production without payment.
Oh.
We just said, okay, Steve and I, we said, we'll be the editors and the production people here. We'll make sure this thing happens. But we didn't take any extra money for it. We just divided the profits up among the freelancers. Whoever worked on it got the exact same percentage. And Steve and I just sort of donated our time doing the production end of it. This was a huge mistake because the production end of it was so complicated and the learning curve was so steep that Steve and I were just in this unbelievable pressure cooker to get this thing produced and done and out on time. Timing was important because, as I mentioned before, the industry itself was just in the process of getting ready to explode. So the way it worked is you would solicit a book and you would get a bunch of orders in. And if you didn't ship the book on time, those orders would have to be resolicited and those orders could go down. And now we were right just as the bubble exploded of this crazy money thing going on in comics is when 63 was released. So if our books had run late, our orders would have disappeared. So we were desperate to get the books out on time. And this the one thing I'm really proud of is that all 6 issues were released on time. I think it's the only Image comic ever that did that. And I kind of feel bad for the retailers who were probably stuck with boxes and boxes of books. But again, we didn't quite understand the ramifications of it, like what was happening to the people on the other end of it. You know, we were just trying to make a success of what we were doing.
That's almost definitely true. I think everything was delayed. It has to be said, you guys were working on this in 1992 because, you know, it was going to come out in 1993. In 1992, among other things, was the death of Superman, and that really changed the market. And
yeah, and at Marvel they were doing like Spider-Man #1 and X-Men #1.
Yeah,
and selling like 6 and 7 million copies. And it was this huge speculator market that people were buying and selling these boxes of books, thinking they were going to be worth money, ignoring the fact that there were so many millions of them printed, they really weren't going to be worth money. And that all just in April of 1993, when Mystery Incorporated was released, that's when the bubble burst.
Oh.
And the whole thing came down. So, and that was why we had to get the books out on time.
Yeah, it's like everyone has a copy of The Death of Superman. so because people thought it was going to sell, and then it was going to put their kids through college. But it's just everyone has a copy, so nobody can sell it.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
A lot of us understood that it wasn't going to be worth anything. And I think if you read some of the background material in 63 that Alan was writing, he makes fun of that.
Yeah.
This collector thing, he's like pushing it, you know?
Do you think, because you were talking about how this is a tactile experience and the production is tough, I actually just spoke to Bill Sienkiewicz about big numbers.
Yeah.
do you think Alan has a tendency to kind of really, come up with these ideas and then it's just ends up being more complicated than he thinks it would be when he comes up with them?
No, I don't think that he knows it's complicated. And his whole life and career is to make comics a higher art form.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that not through promoting himself or, collecting stuff or stuff. It's through his writing. And he's got the most amazing mind. I think he's got what they call eidetic memory,
Okay.
where he actually sees things in his head. He reads a comic book 30 years ago and he can call it up in his memory to the point where he can read it. It's astounding. And he's a voracious reader. He reads thousands of books and millions of comics, and he just absorbs it all in his head. And then he applies that to his storytelling. He asks a lot of his writers and a lot of his artists, and especially poor Bill. I have seen the scripts for Big Numbers. In fact, I've got a copy of Big Numbers #3 that he didn't write, and it is so complicated. It's just unreal.
Yeah. Can you compare what it's like working with Alan in 1983 versus 1993 on 1963?
Well, with 1983, he was writing these incredibly dense scripts.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think the first script he ever sent me was for a story in Epic. And the first panel was 6 pages of typewritten description. The first
Single
panel.
space, probably.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. He had this old Olympia Royal he was typing on in those days. And I've got the script for the double image 80-page giant annual here, the first 11 pages.
So the first 11 pages of a script is what? 2 pages to Alan Moore?
No, I mean 11 pages of comics.
Oh, okay.
And it's maybe 20 odd pages, but he starts out with this incredibly dense description of the Mystery Incorporated dropping out of hyperspace into modern image New York that I could, it's like 2 pages for the first panel. But he also says to Jim along the way, he says, let's see. On the other hand, since you're the artist and thus have a better visual imagination than I do, please feel free to substitute something better if there's any scene which doesn't work for you visually. He essentially says that to every artist he works with. I'm going crazy here, but do whatever you want as long as it works. But it's just the way he thinks. He sits down at the typewriter, and in a first draft, the whole thing comes out, and he's just, super speed, knocking this stuff out. It's really quite extraordinary.
I've heard he doesn't do second drafts.
Right, he doesn't. The rest of us heard that and just went, "Oh my God."
Did you however, it was a different experience working with him doing 1963 going Marvel style, basically?
Yeah. It was, he wrote scripts. He did write scripts, but he often phoned them in first because we were running so late.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd get him on the phone and I'd be roughing out the panels to his descriptions. But then he would finish typing it up and then mail it in. And they were much simpler descriptions that we were getting, but then they would have all the dialogue in them as well. And I'd see if there's anything I had missed or that I had misunderstood on the phone. But the whole scheduling of it was so tight that he often had to phone in the stuff. And we didn't have computers in those days. So it was either faxes or mail to get documents back and forth.
He still doesn't have a computer, does he?
He's got a computer, he just isn't on the internet.
Oh, okay. So speaking of the marriage of old and new, new at the time being 1993, Did you find it weird that you were having trouble creating a book with a production level for which in 1963 would have been the default?
Yeah, because we had to relearn a lot of stuff. And also essentially we had to find a printing press that could print the thing. Like you can't get pulp printed comics anymore. That's gone. So the bigger learning curve though was working with Image. They were kind of in disarray. All those guys had made a huge pile of money, and they were going off and starting studios and buying homes and buying cars and talking to Hollywood. And, you know, they call it the Toad syndrome, take off and die. So they were kind of hard to deal with. And Jim was great. I got to say, Jim was the best thing that happened to us in this whole thing.
Valentino.
Valentino, yeah. He had an assistant coordinator, Randy, I can't remember his last name, and he was fantastic. But we weren't used to having to do our own marketing, solicitation, and production, Steve and I. So we were constantly being hit with, hey, we got to have this by tomorrow. We got to have this by tomorrow. We got to have this by the next day. And it was like every day there'd be something that Image needed from us. And we were on this constant treadmill of learning how to do it, getting it done, and then getting it to them. And this put incredible pressure on Steve and I. We were like pulling all-nighters, you know, just all the time. It was crazy. At the same time, Alan, uncharacteristically, was harder and harder to get a hold of. Like usually we could call him up and get a hold of him. He's there and we could solve problems if we had questions and stuff like that, but he wasn't around. And he would like disappear for a week, 2 weeks at a time. And then when we did get a hold of him, we'd have this laundry list of stuff we needed. So that created tension among us as well.
Did you ever find out the reason he became so hard to get a hold of?
I did. We didn't know it at the time. Later, he shared with me that he had been going through a kind of personal crisis that he couldn't share with us at the time. I don't know if I can really discuss it. You know, he shared with me what was going on. I would say that I read an interview with him not long ago where he talked about that time when he was first getting into magic. And he was exploring magic using psychedelics, and that he had a mini nervous breakdown. I think that's the way he described it. Okay. So I think he was in turmoil, but he wasn't able to tell us that. So we just didn't know what was going on.
With the Image guys, do you think the way you talk about it, you know, they have a lot of success and then it's just they're starting studios and everything. Do you think it was too much too soon for those guys?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think they missed an incredible opportunity to shape comics in a really healthy way moving forward. And instead they became a corrosive force on the art form. But they were younger. They didn't understand.
Do you think maybe it was also a factor that you guys were kind of, you know, you were on the outs with DC and you were coming from DC and those guys had come from Marvel? Was that a factor at all or not?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all.
I just want to point out that 1963 has an insanely talented lineup because aside from you and Alan and Steve, you had John Totleben, Dave Gibbons, Don Simpson, Chester Brown, and John Workman, and then Murphy Anderson on production. That is an incredibly deep lineup.
Yeah. Well, they were all our friends, and we wanted to take care of them all. We saw that we were going to make some money, and we wanted to bring our friends in because we knew that if they had capital, they would do what they really wanted to do, the kind of comics they really wanted to do. And that would be good for our art form.
But I mean, that's such a deep lineup that if one of you were running late, I feel like the others could have just jumped right in and helped out.
That's kind of what happened at the end. Dave Gibbons would just save the day with Tomorrow Syndicate because it was running so late. And by then Steve had left the project. And he inked it and lettered it in record time. And we
Really?
just got it in on the wire. Just, thank you, Dave Gibbons, wherever you are.
That's interesting because you're the credited artist here in Tomorrow Syndicate. It's not.
Well, I'm the penciler. And I'm
Yeah.
also the colorist using the name Mary Marvin Kilroy.
Oh, okay.
But Dave inked and lettered that, and he did it in record time. Well, his wife was sick too. It was like,
Oh,
it
wow.
was just unbelievable. Yeah.
Can you talk about the 1992 San Diego Comic-Con and what happened there?
Yeah, that was like, that was something like right out of a movie or something. We were down on the floor, and Don Simpson came down and said, "Hey, you got to come up here. The Image guys want to talk to you." So we followed him up to the biggest hall. It holds like 5,000 people, and it's full of Image fans. And the Image guys are holding court up there. Todd McFarlane, he's got the mic and he's doing his thing on stage. And the pitch was that they wanted to announce it on stage, that moment, but that we had to agree to Jim Lee taking over the annual, which would have been the ultimate ending of 1963. And we were kind of stuck because we couldn't get a hold of Alan from San Diego. There was no way to say, we had to make that decision ourselves. And I think I was more open to it than Steve was. But ultimately, Jim came down, Jim Valentino came down, we talked it all out. Jim Lee said he really wanted to do this and that he would. I'm not sure if he could have stopped the project. I don't know if it had to have his vote to even happen. That's a good question for Valentino. But we agreed to it, and they announced it. They brought us up on stage. Todd and Rob and these guys were like throwing hats and stuff down to the crowd. The crowd surged the stage. The security guards grabbed us and pulled us away from the crowd and out the back door as the whole place went crazy.
It went crazy because it was announced that Jim Lee would be drawing the annual? Or
well, people it went crazy because Alan Moore was going to be working with Image, but also because of the general craziness of the whole Image thing. People were just rabid for it. And so as they were throwing this merch out to the fans, rushed the stage, and we had to be pulled out by security. It was like being a rock star or something.
That's insane.
Yeah.
Did you was there an artist in place for the annual before Jim Lee kind of put you on the spot?
No. I'm not sure what we were thinking along those lines yet. I would think it would have been Valentino, but I do not remember how we were planning that.
Yeah, Jim Valentino drew the Johnny Beyond feature, and I would have assumed that he would have been the one to draw the modern one. He actually did a follow-up to 1963 in Shadowhawk.
Yep. We let him use the characters,
which no one ever talks about.
Well, it's just one of these little scene things that he's as much a part of this as we were. He was just fantastic.
Yeah. And at the same time, there was a whole thing. It seems weird to me that the Image founders would kind of try to compete with each other, like Jim Lee kind of taking the project from Valentino. Is that did they come off to you as friends or just people who ended up being in the same company together and starting something up together?
Yeah, I can't say they were friendly to us, and they're very, especially Todd and Jim and Rob are very upfront about they want to be the belle of the ball. They want to be the number one. They're pushing. They want to be stars. Where Steve and I and Alan, I don't think that was our goal.
Okay, and at the same time, what happened? At the same time that was going on, 1963, before it was even released, and then Jim Lee was announced as working drawing an Alan Moore comic. Todd hired Alan to write an issue of Spawn. Did that cause waves within the whole thing?
It did with Steve. I wasn't bothered by it. I thought, if Alan can get an offer to draw an issue of Spawn and make $500,000, God bless it. And I knew him well enough and know him well enough to know that he wouldn't let us down. He would finish the project with us as described. He wouldn't just let it dangle. Steve had been working with Alan for a couple of years on From Hell and Taboo. And so I think there was some tension there. Steve trying to edit and organize Alan to get scripts to Eddie to finish From Hell so that could be in Taboo. That was a tension thing. So, Steve kind of, I think, was bringing some of that baggage to it. But he was pretty unhappy with it. And I think in a later interview, he saw it as abandonment of us, but I don't see that at all. It was just, he had an opportunity to bang out a script and make a bunch of money. I would have done it.
Yeah. What led to the annual not being completed? I mean, I know Jim Lee said he was going to take a break for a year, but that seems like a weird thing considering he committed to doing the annual.
Yeah, I know a lot of people are looking to blame someone for it, but it's a bigger situation. Part of it is the nature of the business, which was falling apart at the time. And they'd gone from selling, 6 million copies of Spider-Man to selling 50,000 in the course of, 6 months. The whole industry was coming down. So it didn't make a lot of sense to throw a lot of effort into putting out comics until, the air had cleared and we figured out where the business really was. The biggest problem, I think, is the partnership of Rick, Steve, and Alan. I think if we'd been able to hold our partnership together as friends, then we would have come up with a solution and we would have had the annual of some sort. And I bet you we would have also had more 63 comics following it. But we couldn't hold it together, the three of us. And so if there's blame, it's Rick, Alan, and Steve who just weren't able to hold their thing together.
I wanted to ask about that because it is well documented that Steve and Alan had a falling out. What was your stance at the time, and how was your relationship with them now? Because you ended up working with Alan at Awesome and at ABC after that.
Well, it's sort of like, knowing a couple and loving a couple that divorce and they're all pissed at each other, but you love them both. That's kind of, I'm the monkey in the middle with these two guys. What happened was Steve and I were under unbelievable pressure to get these books out on time, and we were doing it, but like I say, every day was just an incredible struggle. And Steve cracked first. We were just finishing, I was just finishing putting the production for book 5 together, Horus. And out of the blue, Steve sent us a fax, basically resigning from the project. And I'd been talking to him every day, and I had no idea this was coming at me. Alan didn't either. I remember we got on the phone afterwards, and we just couldn't understand like what he was doing. But tried to get a hold of him. He wouldn't pick up the phone. I probably should have tried harder. I should have driven over to his house and tried to talk sense to him, but I was exhausted, and I was kind of mad at him because he had dumped the last book in my lap. We had been taking turns running the production, and he was supposed to be production guy on the 6th book. And by walking away, that meant there was only one person left to do it. So that was a pretty crazy month, I'll tell you.
That was a crazy 6th book too, because it's not just the production. You ended up using a bunch of other characters and, using them in the multiverse alternity spread. You had to get
the coloring starts to change too. It goes from the big dot to all of a sudden this airbrush coloring, and that's what he was planning annual, where the big dot characters land in Image New York, and so you get a taste of where that was going.
did you think, I'm going to try to word this as nicely as I can. Do you think Jim Lee would have been the right person to draw it?
Yeah, he would have been
Okay.
fantastic. But you know, the script I have here is dated December of 1993. So the last issue of 63 shipped in September. So Jim Lee didn't see the script until December.
Wow.
So by then he'd probably lost interest. I think this is another thing that I think is our fault. Steve and I thought Jim Valentino was dealing with Jim Lee. Jim Valentino thought Steve and I were dealing with Jim Lee. So Jim Lee didn't hear from us all during this.
So ever since he took the assignment at the 1992 Comic-Con, he didn't know anything about it.
Other than the comics were coming out, but we weren't in touch with him, calling him up and telling him how things were going and making sure he was on board, because we thought Valentino was doing it. Valentino thought we were doing it.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating.
So by the time the script comes out, he had decided to take a sabbatical from doing comics. And so, but again, I think if Steve and Alan and Rick had their shit together, we would have gotten that annual done somehow and finished the project off, because that's the type of people we were. But it was just such a miserable thing had happened to our personal relationship that it just died right there.
And you and Steve kept on trying to get it reprinted, right?
Yeah. Well, that was the thing. At least we could reprint, you know, the 6 issues. And we also tried various schemes to do the annual as well. But by then, Steve had done an interview with the Comics Journal where he kind of went after Alan, said a lot of things that Alan didn't like. And Alan broke off his relationship with Steve.
Yeah.
So that essentially kills it right there, because, you know, I tried to bring the two of them together. You know how it is. We know people that love each other but are mad. But it didn't work. And 63 became a casualty of that.
Is that friendship, like, is it one-sided in the sense that, or do both of them not want to work it out?
I think Steve would like to work it out, but Alan just shut him down. And I would try to talk Alan into speaking to Steve, and Alan was always, you know, he didn't talk negatively about Steve. He would just sort of gently say, no, I don't want to work with him anymore, like that, and just go on to other things.
Oh. You guys ended up splitting the characters from 1963. It's documented. Steve Bissette got N-Man, Fury, the Hypernaut, Commander Solo, and her Screaming Sky Dogs. Did you and Alan split the rest, or did you get the rest of it? And Alan
and I own it, but I don't think everything will ever be done with it, because he's quit comics now too. So I think it's pretty much over with. But that was the last nail in the coffin in terms of our 3-way friendship partnership, because anytime where you have to like break something apart like that contractually with lawyers, it just sucks. You know, it's just terrible. And so that was the last bad taste in the mouth of 1963 right there.
And that happened around 1998, right? Or around that.
I guess I can't remember what year it was, but
yeah, I've heard that you tried taking this to Dynamite to.
Yep. Yeah, we talked to me about buying it, but their offer was, you know, abysmally low. Dynamite wanted to do a collection, and at first Alan said, okay, as long as my name wasn't in it. But then he made it clear that if we went ahead, he would never speak to me again. And so I knew then that, you know, I didn't want that. And I knew that he didn't want to have it out there. And as a partner, he has that right to say no, just like as a partner, I would have the right to say no.
Is it tough being friends with Alan Moore?
No, it's been very fruitful relationship.
Yeah.
I consider myself really lucky to have met the guy. He's an extraordinary person, extraordinary mind. And what he's done to comics I mean, they used to have a saying in at DC Comics that certain characters, like Superman and Batman, were the lightning in the bottle. And that
Mhm.
whenever you created a character, you wanted to catch the lightning in the bottle. Well, Alan is the lightning in the bottle. He can take any character and rehab it and bring depth and wisdom to it that no one else can. I I look back at his time at DC and I just wonder why they never gave him Superman, because we'd be living in a different world if Alan had taken Superman on and done a full run on it.
Yeah, I was talking to his daughter Leah, and she was saying that as much money as Watchmen has made DC, they probably would have made more money if they just gave him back Watchmen and kept him on the staff.
Yeah, I mean, if I had been Paul Levitz, I would have established a personal relationship with Alan Moore. I would have called him up, and whatever he needed and whatever he wanted, I would have done it, and
Mhm.
they kept him there. I mean, could you imagine DC with Alan and Dave Gibbons doing Superman and Frank doing Batman?
Yeah.
You know, can you imagine? But they missed it. They missed it, and they were greedy. They killed the goose that laid the golden egg, and they paid for it. I mean, I was privy to a lot of the shit they did to Alan, and it's like awful what they did to him, and it's no wonder he's angry and he's walked away from comics.
You got some of that too, though, with with your last Swamp Thing issue,
Oh
and
yeah, yeah. Well, but not like him, because like I say, he was the lightning in the bottle. He was the prize, and they they just didn't handle him right. You know, if they had been enlightened businessmen, like I say, we'd be living in a different world right now.
that goes true also for Image and for DC the second time, Wildstorm, and all that. Speaking of lightning in a bottle, how, like, I know this has nothing to do with 1963, but how did it feel when Alan Moore, when he ended Swamp Thing, said that the perfect person to follow him on Swamp Thing on writing duties is you?
Well, you know, on the phone to me, he and I would make jokes that I was committing career suicide because, you know, it's like following the Beatles on stage. You know, the guy is just so good. Um, but I felt I wanted to do it because I loved the characters, and I loved working with Karen Berger, who was just like a fantastic editor. So I took it on. You know, it was a mistake because it ultimately blew up in my face. But you know, I still got to do a lot of good comics.
It's a legendary run that followed a legendary run. Um, Going back to 1963, one of the things that I found, like, I just want to talk about the creative side of it a bit. You put it in the 1960s type storytelling, but you guys were using modern science. It gives us this really kind of psychedelic or kind of like cognitive dissonance in terms of the way we're experiencing it. Was
Yeah.
how did you guys approach that type of marriage of old and new?
Well, that's Alan. One of his things of study is hyperphysics, and that's one of the great things I would learn from him on the phone. Is he would read these scientific journals, like how quantum works, and how multiple dimensions work, and all that kind of stuff. And he'd explain it to me so I could understand it. And that's what he was bringing into 1963, figuring that Crystal Man, being the sort of Reed Richards big brain kind of guy, would know this stuff, even in 1963.
Oh, so that was the concept behind it, and you explored a lot of these themes and a lot of this as well as you moved forward to, to Awesome and to America's Best Comics. It seems like at that time period. I
That's
mean,
that.
yeah, yeah,
Well, I mean, there's another part of the '63 tragedy, because if we'd held it together, we wouldn't have been working for Awesome, and there wouldn't have been ABC. Alan would have been exploring all this retro stuff he had in him through 1963, and we would have benefited from it. They'd
it,
probably we'd still be doing them today.
it would have just been a line on its own to kind of explore from there. So like, you know, so basically what you're saying is that stuff like that you did with Glacier, Tom Strong, etc., it would have eventually shown up in 1963.
Sure. Supreme,
Yeah.
because Alan really is a Superman writer. Like he wants to do Superman, and he would have brought him into 1963 somehow.
Yeah, that is insane that they never gave him Superman, now that you mention it.
Yeah.
And also with 1963, you know, you went insane on these ads, and and you teased 1963 and a half. Was this a
Okay.
real thing that was going to happen eventually, or?
No, what it was Paul Mavridis, who is an underground cartoonist who works like for Zap, had a project called 1963 in the works that we didn't know about until we were a couple issues in. And like he, you know, sent word to us and going, "Hey, I'm doing 1963 too." And I think it was Mark Baudet kind of was a middleman between us and helped us work it out, where we said, if you just change yours to 1963 and a half, we'll change the title. We'll give you, you know, promotion space inside of our 1963 books. And he thought that was a great thing. So there is part of the story of 1963 and a half is in the Tomorrow Syndicate.
Oh, I did not know that. That's cool.
Yeah. It's folded in.
Yeah.
Paul never finished. It's 1963 and a half. So I don't know whatever happened to that. But he was a nice guy to let us have that title.
Did you have a favorite Marvel comic? Because these are based on old Silver Age Marvel comics. Do you have a favorite Marvel comic?
Well, I grew up on Marvels. You know, I caught it right at the beginning. I think my first Marvel comic was Fantastic Four #3, and I just bought every Marvel after that. You know, Jack Kirby is like the guy for me. In fact, I named my #2 son Kirby in honor of Jack. It was such a great thing as a kid growing up that every 2 weeks you go down to the store and there's a new Jack Kirby Marvel comic, just full of the most amazing graphics and story ideas and stuff. And then all this Marvel stuff in the background, you know, it was really great.
And yeah,
no single favorite.
no single favorite. Fantastic Four #3. I think that's also Alan's first Marvel comic.
Yeah, he's a couple years younger than me. Yeah,
that's a fun coincidence. Do you have anything else to say about 1963 as we wrap up?
I'd just like to apologize to all the fans out there that we blew it. And I don't think Jim Lee is the culprit here. I think it was a much larger mess than just Jim. And I take blame for us 3 partners who should have held it together, but we didn't, for the reason it didn't happen. But I apologize to the fans. I would like nothing better than to have continued this work, but it just didn't happen.
That's too gracious of you for you to take blame for 3 people.
Well, you know, I kick myself because I think there were times where I could have talked sense to Steve. You know, we go back so far and we were so tight, and but I was just exhausted and I was mad because the thing was dumped in my lap. So I didn't do what I should have done, I don't think.
Do you and Steve still talk? You still have plans on working together?
We're still friends. You know, we don't work together in a day-to-day basis, but you know, we're still good friends. We've got this amazing history together, and put us in the same room and creative sparks fly still.
Is there anything else, anything you're working on that you'd like to plug right now?
Well, if people want to see my new stuff, they can just go on Amazon. I've been releasing new Max Immortal work called Boy Max Immortal. I've been releasing new issues of Rarebit Fiends, my dream comic. And I've been doing this series called Panel Vision, which are comic books that are 1 panel per page. And I think I've released 4 of those now. And I'm doing all that through Amazon. And you look me up there, you'll find it.
And my last question is, how do you think things would have been different if you did 1963 like within the last 10 years instead of in 1993?
Boy, that's a good question. We wouldn't have made as much money, that's for sure. Sales have just dwindled. I mean, the whole market is down to nothing now. So, I don't know. It's one of those questions I just can't answer. It was perfectly timed for its day to do it 30 years after 1963 in 1993. And it was also, Alan was making a point about how Image comics were getting lamer and lamer. And he was going to show how the rich past of comics stood up against modern Image comics. And like when he writes the dialogue for the Image characters, he's like this incredible literary mimic, and he writes just like Rob Liefeld and Todd McFarlane. So it's kind of hilarious when you read it.
Is that in the script, in the 10 pages of script?
Yep.
Is that ever anything you'd be willing to share? I'm guessing no, because if you found it, then.
Well, I know I would have to like scan it and put it on the internet. It might already be out there, because I'm not the only one with it. This copy came from Homage Studios, so it came from Jim Lee to me.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, so it must be out there. But if not, I could probably scan it and get it out there.
That would be funny. Like if I could just show a graphic of a line of dialogue as you're saying it.
Maybe I can read something here. Here's Bedrock. Are these dweebs for real? There's also a set of interviews that we did for one of the comics feature, one of those comics mags, where we did interviews in character as Roaring Rick and Affable Al and Sturdy Steve and Mary Marvin Kilroy. That's on the internet somewhere, and that's really worth a read if you can dig that up.
Yeah, I'll go look for that. And my real last question is, all of the, we talk about how the comics market has dwindled and how that burst in 1992, 1993. The lower sales now, like what exactly do you think is causing it, and how do you think we could fix it?
I don't think it can be fixed. There's a lot of different issues. One of them is that print is changing over to digital, and comics are right there. I mean, there's still people that love the printed comics, but there are very few magazines that are printed anymore. They all go to digital first, and so comics have to make that transition. If you listen to what Jim Lee's talking about in his interviews as publisher, that's where DC is moving. Mm-hmm. They're pulling out of the direct sales market. Direct sales market is now 40 years old, and it's dwindled down to nothing. Where we used to have 14 distributors, we have one Diamond. And since they have had a monopoly, the quality of comics have gone down, the sales have gone down. It's just like a dying sort of form. And I don't think there is a way to resuscitate that. So look to the future as digital, and maybe there might be a way to sell digital products, and you could also, if you wanted the print one, you could press a button and get it in the mail or something. But I don't think there's going to be comic book stores anymore.
How much do you think quality has to do with it? Because a lot of fans my age, I'm 38, so a lot of fans my age like to say something like, "Oh, it's because comics suck now," and instead of back in my day in the mid 90s and
right. Yeah. But the reason they suck is from the business, because of business. People have approached the business, and in 1998, when the second collapse happened in comics, they created the system where there was only 5 publishers who got decent deal with Diamond, and all the rest of us were cut out. So in that sense, they cut out the grassroots creative power of American comics, which had really been what had empowered the 80s, where all these people were just coming out of the cracks making comics all over the place, and they could get them distributed. Now, once 1998 happened, that all ended, and the small little guy publishers were starved, and they couldn't get their books out. So that's what's wrong, that this powerful creative upswelling was halted by the business guys for their own profits. So maybe when we get to digital, that groundswell will come back up. You know, all that creativity. There's a lot of people out there doing great comics that are just never seen, never on shelves.
Do you think crowdfunding could be the answer to that?
It seems to be. I mean, I haven't done it myself, but I know a lot of people are working that way. And even some of the publishers who have, you know, great deals with Diamond are over there, you know, crowdfunding on Kickstarter. So it tells you that their system just ain't working anymore.
Okay. That was my last question. Thank you so much, Mr.
Yeah, thank
Veitch.
you for-
Hope we can do this again sometime.
Sure. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you.